On May 15, 2024, at approximately 11:47 p.m., a 911 call came through to the Franklin County Dispatch Center in Brookdale, Ohio. The caller identified himself as 40-year-old Michael Porter. His voice, according to the dispatch recording later reviewed by investigators, was measured almost unnaturally calm for someone reporting an emergency. He stated that his wife, Grace, who used a wheelchair due to a degenerative condition, had fallen and was unresponsive. Within 6 minutes, paramedics from Station 12 arrived at the Porter residence on Maple Ridge Drive, a quiet residential street where porch lights remained on late into the evening and neighbors knew each other by name. When first responder Sarah Chen stepped through the front door, she encountered a scene that immediately registered as inconsistent. Grace Porter lay on the living room floor, her wheelchair overturned several feet away, positioned in a way that suggested force rather than a simple fall. An oxygen mask, which Grace reportedly relied on nightly, was torn from her face and lay discarded near the coffee table. Chen's partner, Marcus Wade, later testified that the room felt staged, as though someone had arranged the scene to tell a particular story. Michael Porter stood in the corner of the room, hands in his pockets, watching the paramedics work with what Wade described as detachment. There were no visible tears, no frantic questions, just a stillness that didn't match the gravity of the moment unfolding before him. Grace was pronounced dead at 12:03 a.m. on May 16th, less than 20 minutes after the first call. The preliminary assessment pointed to respiratory failure, potentially linked to her known medical complications. But something about the scene unsettled the responding officers. The question wasn't just what had happened in that living room, it was why the physical evidence didn't align with the story being told. And as investigators from the Brookdale Police Department began piecing together the fragments of that night, examining every surface, every word, every inconsistency, one thing became undeniably clear. This wasn't just a medical emergency. It was the opening chapter of a mystery that would expose a truth no one in that house, not even Grace herself until it was too late, had ever expected. Before we go deeper into this investigation, subscribe if you love true crime documentaries, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's return to the beginning, to the lives that were built before everything came crashing down. On June 14, 2014, exactly 10 years before Grace Porter was found dead, 30-year-old Michael Porter married 28-year-old Grace Williams at Brookdale Community Church, a modest brick building that had served the town for over 70 years. To those who attended the ceremony, it was a union that seemed destined, the kind of marriage that restored faith in commitment and partnership. But to understand what happened on that May night in 2024, we must first understand who these people were, how their paths converged, and what invisible fractures existed beneath the surface of what everyone believed was a perfect marriage. Michael Porter grew up on the working-class side of Brookdale, the only son of a factory foreman and a grocery store clerk who worked double shifts to keep their family afloat. His childhood home on Elm Street was small but meticulously maintained, a reflection of his father's belief that discipline and appearance mattered. Michael learned early that perception could open doors that background alone could not. He graduated from Brookdale High School in 2002 with decent grades, not exceptional but consistent, and enrolled at Cuyahoga Community College to study construction management. His professors remembered him as a student who showed up on time, completed assignments without complaint, and possessed a quiet charisma that made him easy to work with. By his late 20s, Michael had climbed the ranks at Hale Construction, a regional firm known for commercial projects across Ohio. He supervised crews twice his age, managed budgets in the six-figure range, and earned a reputation as someone who delivered results without drama. Colleagues described him as likable but private, the kind of man who shared work stories but rarely personal details. He dressed well for someone in his field, always in pressed shirts and clean boots, projecting an image of competence and reliability. At Brookdale Community Church, where he attended sporadically but consistently enough to be recognized, Michael volunteered occasionally on building repairs and coached the youth baseball team during summer months. His pastor, Reverend Thomas Caldwell, later told reporters that Michael was the kind of man you'd trust with your house keys, someone who projected steadiness and integrity. Grace Williams, by contrast, came from a family marked by resilience and quiet strength. The second of 3 daughters raised by a single mother who taught 4th grade at Brookdale Elementary, Grace grew up understanding the value of service and sacrifice. Her mother, Margaret Williams, worked long hours, not just to support her daughters financially, but to instill in them the belief that education and compassion were the greatest tools a person could possess. After completing her undergraduate degree in psychology at Ohio State University, Grace pursued graduate studies in counseling, choosing public education over more lucrative private practice because, as she once wrote in a journal entry later recovered by investigators, the children who need help the most are the ones no one else wants to reach. By 26, Grace had become a full-time school counselor at Brookdale Elementary, the same school where her mother taught. She was known not for flashy programs or bureaucratic achievements, but for the way she listened. Students said she remembered every name, every detail, every fear they shared with her, treating their concerns with the seriousness they deserved. A parent once wrote to the principal describing how Grace had helped her son through a severe anxiety disorder, noting that she talked to him like he mattered, not like he was broken. Outside of work, Grace volunteered at a literacy program for adults and helped her mother organize Sunday potlucks at the church, events that brought together families who might not otherwise connect. Friends described her as calm in a world that ran loud, someone who didn't need to fill silence with noise because she understood that presence itself could be healing. Their paths crossed on a humid September evening in 2013 at a fundraiser for youth mentorship held at the Brookdale Community Center, a renovated gymnasium that still smelled faintly of floor wax and sweat. Grace was stationed near the entrance, handing out raffle tickets and greeting attendees with the kind of warmth that made people feel they'd been expected. Michael arrived with 2 co-workers, still in dusty work boots from a job site, and purchased a strip of raffle tickets. He smiled and said, according to a friend who overheard the exchange, "You're the first person to greet me tonight." Grace laughed and replied, "Then I'm already winning." That simple exchange led to a dinner table conversation later that evening where they discussed students, building projects, and the kind of neighborhoods they wanted to live in someday. A mutual friend who sat beside them remembered Michael saying, "You make small talk feel like something important," and Grace responding, "That's because people usually are." They started dating a week later. Their first date took place at an open location, a diner called Miller's Cafe that had been serving Brookdale for decades, the kind of place where waitresses refilled your cup without asking and knew your order by the 3rd visit. Grace ordered tea, Michael ordered black coffee, and they stayed until closing time talking about everything and nothing, the kind of conversation that feels effortless when 2 people genuinely connect. She liked that he didn't check his phone once during the entire evening. He liked that she asked about his crew by name, after hearing just one story about a difficult project. Over the following months, they built a rhythm that felt natural and sustainable. Church on Sundays, movies on Fridays, yard sale hunts on Saturdays, where they searched for vintage furniture and mismatched dishes. When winter arrived, they spent nights cooking together, Grace making her mother's chili recipe, while Michael insisted on adding what he jokingly called a contractor's pinch of salt, which was always too much. By spring 2014, everyone around them recognized where the relationship was heading. Michael's co-worker later recalled that he stopped talking about deadlines and started talking about rings. Grace's sister remembered receiving a text message that read simply, "He's different. He listens even when I'm quiet." On Valentine's Day 2014, Michael proposed at Riverside Park, the same place they'd walked during their second week of dating. He got down on one knee, hands visibly trembling, and said, "You complete me." Grace laughed through tears and responded, "Then let's keep each other standing." Their wedding that June was modest but meaningful, attended by approximately 90 guests, a mix of family, colleagues, and half the church congregation packed into pews under soft afternoon light filtering through stained glass windows. Grace wore lace borrowed from her mother's wedding gown, a detail that brought Margaret to tears before the ceremony even began. Michael's best man was his younger brother, Daniel Porter, who delivered a toast describing Michael as someone who'd finally found the person who made him want to be better. The vows were simple, devoid of poetry or grandiose declarations, just plain promises they wrote themselves, and delivered with voices that occasionally cracked under the weight of emotion. Grace said, "Michael, you are the man I didn't know I needed." Michael responded, "Grace, you are my reason to breathe slowly." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the congregation cheered loud enough to drown out the organ's final notes. The reception took place in the church hall, decorated with mason jars filled with wildflowers and string lights that cast a warm glow over folding tables covered in white cloth. Grace's students dropped by to hand her flowers, small gestures that meant more to her than any expensive gift. One of them, a shy sophomore named Emma, hugged Grace and whispered, "You deserve all of this." Grace smiled and replied, "So will you someday if you stay kind." Guests still remember the laughter, the slow dance to Stand By Me playing through borrowed speakers, and Michael whispering forever as they walked out under a shower of confetti thrown by children who'd stayed past their bedtime just to see the bride leave. The first years of marriage appear to embody everything a small town holds up as proof that goodness exists. They purchased a 2-story home on Maple Ridge Drive, the kind with a white mailbox and a mature maple tree out front that turned brilliant shades of orange every October. Grace converted the spare bedroom into an office, stacking it with student files and sticky notes that read, "Remember to breathe," small reminders to herself during stressful days. Michael renovated the kitchen himself, installing new cabinets and countertops while proudly declaring, "No contractor markup here." On Sundays, they hosted lunch for friends who didn't have family nearby, opening their home to anyone who needed a place to belong. When neighbors described them, they used words like solid, decent, real. A friend once told a reporter, "If you needed a model for commitment, you pointed to the Porters." To everyone who knew them, Michael and Grace Porter were the couple that gave you hope, proof that love and hard work could still hold a marriage together in an era when so many relationships crumbled under pressure. But every perfect smile has shadows, and Michael's were about to surface in ways no one could have predicted. 7 years after saying "I do," Grace Porter received news that should have strengthened her household, but instead it planted the seed that would quietly tear everything apart. In March 2021, Grace's dedication at Brookdale Elementary finally translated into formal recognition. For years, she had been known as the counselor who stayed late, the teacher who showed up early, and the woman who never lost patience even with the most challenging cases. Parents trusted her because she didn't just file reports and move on, she followed through, checking in weeks and months later to ensure progress continued. Students confided in her because she listened without judgment, creating a space where vulnerability felt safe. Her principal, Dr. Linda Marsh, once said in a staff meeting, "Grace doesn't clock out, she cares out loud." When a fellow teacher congratulated her on her consistent performance reviews, Grace smiled and said softly, "We all do important work, I'm just doing my part." That humility was what made everyone root for her advancement. So when the school board announced a new lead counselor position in April 2021, Grace's name naturally rose to the top of the list. Her performance reviews were spotless. Her programs for struggling students had improved attendance rates across 3 grades, a measurable impact that administrators valued highly. Even the superintendent, who rarely involved himself in personnel decisions at individual schools, noted Grace's influence during board meetings. The promotion came with expanded responsibility, overseeing counseling services across the entire district, and a salary increase of approximately $18,000 annually. On paper, it was a professional milestone, the kind of achievement that validated years of hard work and sacrifice. In reality, it marked the beginning of a personal decline Grace never saw coming, a shift that would expose fractures in her marriage she didn't know existed. That evening, Grace waited for Michael to arrive home from a job site in Columbus, nearly an hour away. She prepared his favorite dinner, grilled salmon with roasted potatoes seasoned exactly the way he preferred, and set the table with candles she typically reserved for special occasions. When Michael stepped through the door, Grace rushed to him, holding the official letter in her hand, her face glowing with excitement. "Honey, guess what?" she said. "I got the promotion. The board approved it this morning." Michael's reaction, according to Grace's journal entries later recovered during the investigation, was not what she expected. He smiled, offered a brief congratulations, but his tone felt flat, lacking the enthusiasm she'd anticipated. Over dinner, the conversation remained surface level. Michael asked logistical questions about her new schedule and responsibilities, but avoided discussing how the promotion might affect their life together. Grace later wrote in her journal, "Something felt off tonight, like he was somewhere else entirely." Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged that Grace initially attributed to work stress. Michael became increasingly distant, spending longer hours at job sites and returning home later than usual, often after Grace had already gone to bed. When she asked about his day, his responses were short, deflecting rather than engaging. He stopped initiating physical affection, stopped asking about her students, stopped participating in the Sunday lunches they used to host together. Grace confided in her sister Emily during a phone call in late April 2021, telling her, "It's like I'm living with a stranger who looks like my husband." Emily suggested marriage counseling, but Grace hesitated, worried that pushing the issue might make things worse. By early summer 2021, Grace noticed physical changes in herself that she initially dismissed as symptoms of stress. She felt persistently fatigued, experiencing exhaustion that didn't improve with rest. She developed recurring headaches that over-the-counter medication barely touched. Her appetite diminished, and she began losing weight without trying. When she mentioned these symptoms to Michael, he suggested she was working too hard, adjusting to new responsibilities, and simply needed to slow down. Grace wanted to believe him. She scheduled an appointment with her primary care physician, Dr. Helen Ortiz, who conducted routine blood work and a physical examination. The results came back unremarkable, showing no obvious cause for her symptoms. Dr. Ortiz suggested stress management techniques, recommended vitamin supplements, and advised Grace to monitor her condition over the next few months. If symptoms persisted or worsened, they would investigate further. Grace left the appointment feeling somewhat reassured, believing her body was simply reacting to the demands of her new position. But the symptoms didn't improve. By fall 2021, Grace's fatigue had intensified to the point where she struggled to complete tasks that once felt effortless. She found herself napping during lunch breaks, something she'd never done before. Her colleagues noticed the change. Dr. Marsh pulled her aside one afternoon and asked if everything was all right, expressing concern about Grace's appearance and energy levels. Grace assured her it was temporary, that she was adjusting, that everything would stabilize soon. But privately, Grace began to worry. She returned to Dr. Ortiz in November 2021, describing the persistence of her symptoms and adding new concerns, frequent infections, night sweats, and unexplained bruising on her arms and legs. Dr. Ortiz ordered more comprehensive testing, including panels for autoimmune disorders and vitamin deficiencies. Again, the results showed nothing conclusive. Grace's frustration grew. She felt dismissed, as though her body was betraying her, and the medical system couldn't provide answers. Meanwhile, Michael's behavior grew more erratic. He began working weekends, claiming projects had fallen behind schedule and required extra hours. He started password protecting his phone, a change Grace noticed but didn't initially question, assuming it was related to work security. When she suggested they take a weekend trip together, something they used to do regularly, Michael declined, citing financial concerns, despite the fact that their combined income had increased significantly with Grace's promotion. Grace's journal from this period, later entered as evidence during the trial, reveals her internal struggle. She wrote in December 2021, "I don't recognize my marriage anymore. I don't recognize my body, and I don't recognize the woman staring back at me in the mirror." That entry, written late at night while Michael slept in the guest room, captured the isolation Grace felt, trapped between a failing body and a failing marriage with no clear explanation for either. By early 2022, Grace's condition had deteriorated to the point where it began affecting her ability to work. She developed respiratory issues, struggling to catch her breath after minimal exertion. She experienced persistent gastrointestinal problems that left her nauseated and unable to eat full meals. Her weight loss became noticeable, prompting concerned questions from friends and family that she deflected with vague explanations about stress and medication adjustments. In February 2022, Grace's symptoms reached a crisis point. She collapsed at work during a routine counseling session with a student, losing consciousness for several seconds before a colleague called 911. She was transported to Brookdale Medical Center, where emergency room physicians conducted extensive testing, including imaging and blood work. It was during this hospitalization that Dr. Samuel Chen, an infectious disease specialist called in for consultation, identified markers in Grace's blood that raised immediate concern. Her white blood cell count was abnormally low, her immune system was severely compromised, and her symptoms collectively pointed toward a diagnosis that Dr. Chen approached with extreme caution. He ordered an HIV test. Grace later described the moment Dr. Chen delivered the results as the instant her entire world fractured. She tested positive for HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. She had been living with the infection for an unknown period, likely years based on the progression of her symptoms. Grace's initial reaction, according to hospital records, was disbelief. She insisted there must be a mistake, that the test must be wrong, that she'd never engaged in any behavior that would expose her to the virus. Dr. Chen gently explained that HIV transmission doesn't require high-risk behavior, that it can occur through any exchange of bodily fluids, and that many people contract the virus from partners they trust completely. He asked Grace directly if there was any possibility her husband could have exposed her. Grace's response, documented in her medical file, was immediate and certain. "No," she said. "Michael wouldn't do that to me. We've been faithful. There has to be another explanation." But as she sat alone in that hospital room, waiting for Michael to arrive after being called by hospital staff, doubt began creeping in. She thought about his emotional distance, his refusal of physical intimacy, his secrecy about his phone, his unexplained absences. She thought about the timeline of her symptoms, which had begun shortly after they resumed physical relations, following a brief period of distance in early 2021. When Michael finally arrived at the hospital, Grace watched his face carefully as Dr. Chen explained her diagnosis. Michael's expression, Grace later wrote in her journal, showed something she'd never seen before, not shock, not confusion, but recognition. He already knew. That realization, crystallizing in a sterile hospital room under fluorescent lights, marked the moment Grace understood she'd been living a lie. Michael Porter, the man she'd trusted with her life, had infected her with a deadly virus and never said a word. The man who once whispered forever under a shower of confetti had condemned her to a slow, painful death. And as Grace lay in that hospital bed, struggling to process the magnitude of betrayal she was facing, one question consumed her thoughts. How long had he known, and what else had he been hiding? The days following Grace's diagnosis became a psychological battlefield. According to medical records and journal entries later recovered, Grace spent 3 days hospitalized while doctors stabilized her condition and initiated antiretroviral therapy to manage the virus. During those 72 hours, Michael visited daily, sitting beside her bed with what hospital staff described as an unsettling composure. He didn't cry. He didn't express anger or confusion. He simply sat there, occasionally holding her hand, offering reassurances that felt hollow even as he spoke them. Grace, according to her sister Emily's testimony, used those hospital visits to study Michael, searching his face for any sign of guilt or remorse. She didn't confront him directly at first, still clinging to the possibility that there might be some other explanation, some misunderstanding that could make sense of the nightmare unfolding around her. But on the evening of her 3rd day in the hospital, Grace asked Michael a direct question. "Have you been tested?" Michael hesitated, a pause that lasted just seconds but felt eternal. He told her he'd get tested immediately, that they'd figure this out together. That response, Grace later wrote, told her everything she needed to know. He didn't say no, he didn't offer reassurance, he simply deflected. When Grace returned home on February 19, 2022, the atmosphere in the house had fundamentally shifted. The warmth and partnership that once defined their marriage had evaporated, replaced by tension so thick it became difficult to breathe. Grace stopped sleeping in their shared bedroom, moving her belongings into the office she'd converted years earlier. Michael didn't protest. They moved around each other like ghosts, occupying the same physical space while existing in completely separate realities. Grace threw herself into research, spending hours online learning about HIV transmission, treatment options, legal ramifications, and survivor stories. What she discovered both terrified and enraged her. In Ohio, knowingly transmitting HIV to another person without their informed consent constituted a felony, punishable by significant prison time. If Michael had known he was positive and had sexual contact with her without disclosure, he hadn't just betrayed her trust, he'd committed a serious crime. Grace needed confirmation. On March 3, 2022, she confronted Michael directly. She waited until he returned home from work, intercepting him in the kitchen before he could retreat to another room. She demanded to know if he'd been tested, and if so, what the results showed. Michael, according to Grace's account shared with her sister later that evening, stood frozen for several seconds before admitting the truth. He told her he'd tested positive for HIV in 2018, nearly 4 years before Grace's diagnosis, and had been taking medication to manage the virus. He claimed he didn't tell her because he was afraid of losing her, afraid she'd leave if she knew. Grace's response, captured in a voice memo she recorded immediately after the conversation, revealed the depth of her devastation. "You've been lying to me for 4 years," she said, her voice shaking. "You infected me. You watched me get sicker and sicker, and you said nothing. How could you do this?" Michael's explanation, as Grace recounted it, centered on fear and denial. He claimed he thought the medication would keep his viral load undetectable, making transmission impossible. He insisted he never intended to hurt her, that he loved her, that he'd made a terrible mistake born from panic rather than malice. But Grace wasn't interested in excuses. The man she'd trusted had weaponized intimacy, turning their marriage bed into a crime scene. Every kiss, every intimate moment they'd shared since 2018 had been built on a foundation of lies. Grace told Michael she wanted him out of the house. She told him she was considering filing a police report. She told him their marriage was over. Michael pleaded with her, begging for another chance, promising he'd do anything to make things right. But Grace had reached her limit. She told him to leave and give her space to think. Michael left that night, staying with his brother Daniel, and for the first time in years, Grace slept soundly, not because she'd found peace, but because the truth, as painful as it was, had finally emerged from the shadows. Over the following weeks, Grace's health continued to decline despite medical intervention. The late diagnosis meant the virus had already significantly damaged her immune system, leaving her vulnerable to opportunistic infections and complications. In April 2022, she developed pneumonia severe enough to require hospitalization. In May, she experienced neurological symptoms, including severe headaches and episodes of confusion that terrified her. Her doctors adjusted her medication regimen repeatedly, searching for a combination that would stabilize her condition without causing unbearable side effects. Throughout this period, Grace maintained contact with Michael, not because she wanted reconciliation, but because she needed answers. She needed to understand how the man she'd married, the man who'd stood before their friends and family and promised to cherish her, could have done something so unforgivable. During one of their conversations in early June 2022, Michael broke down, admitting details that painted an even darker picture. He confessed to an ongoing affair with Robert Hale, his former boss at Hale Construction. The relationship, Michael claimed, had begun in 2016, 2 years into his marriage to Grace. Robert Hale was married with children, living a double life that mirrored Michael's own deception. Michael admitted that he'd contracted HIV through this relationship, testing positive in 2018 after experiencing symptoms similar to those Grace would later develop. He'd started medication immediately, managing his condition in secret while continuing to share a bed with Grace. He never told Robert. He never told Grace. He simply carried the secret, building walls around it with lies and deflection until those walls finally collapsed. Grace recorded portions of this conversation on her phone, a decision that would later prove crucial. She asked Michael why he continued sleeping with her after his diagnosis. Michael's response, delivered in a voice barely above a whisper, was chilling. He said he didn't think it would actually happen, that he believed the medication made him safe, that he convinced himself the risk was minimal. Grace asked if he'd warned Robert. Michael admitted he hadn't, terrified that revealing his status would expose the affair and destroy both their lives. Grace's final question in that recorded conversation cut through every excuse Michael offered. "So, you loved yourself more than you loved me?" Michael didn't answer, his silence confirming what Grace already knew. The affair with Robert Hale added another layer of betrayal to an already devastating situation. Grace realized she'd been living in a marriage that existed only as a facade, a performance staged for the benefit of friends, family, and community, while Michael pursued a secret life that had ultimately cost her everything. By summer 2022, Grace's physical condition had worsened to the point where she required full-time care. Her respiratory capacity had diminished, forcing her to rely on supplemental oxygen throughout the day and night. Her mobility became severely limited, and by August, she was using a wheelchair for anything beyond short distances. Her employer, Brookdale Elementary, granted her extended medical leave, but Grace knew she wouldn't return. The career she'd built, the students she'd served, the identity she'd constructed around helping others, all of it was slipping away, collateral damage from Michael's lies. Throughout these months, Michael made repeated attempts at reconciliation. He sent text messages apologizing, left voicemails expressing regret, and showed up at the house unannounced, hoping to talk. Grace initially engaged with these attempts, not because she forgave him, but because she wanted him to understand the magnitude of what he'd done. But eventually she stopped responding. She focused instead on documenting everything, keeping detailed records of Michael's admissions, collecting evidence of the affair, and consulting with attorneys about her legal options. Grace had always been methodical, a trait that served her well as a counselor, and she applied that same careful attention to building a case against the man who'd destroyed her life. By late 2023, Grace's health had stabilized somewhat, though she remained dependent on oxygen and wheelchair-bound. Her doctors described her condition as managed but fragile, requiring constant vigilance and medication adherence to prevent further deterioration. Grace used this period of relative stability to make plans. She consulted with Detective Sarah Mitchell at the Brookdale Police Department, discussing the possibility of filing criminal charges against Michael for felony transmission of HIV. Detective Mitchell listened carefully, taking notes as Grace outlined the timeline, provided medical records, and played portions of the recorded conversations where Michael admitted knowing his status before infecting her. Mitchell explained that while the evidence was compelling, prosecuting these cases could be complex, requiring not just proof of transmission, but proof of intent and knowledge. Grace understood the challenges but remained determined. She told Detective Mitchell, "I don't want revenge, I want justice, and I want other women to know this can happen." Detective Mitchell opened a preliminary investigation in January 2024, beginning with interviews and evidence collection. Grace provided everything she'd gathered, meticulous documentation spanning nearly 2 years. But as investigators began building the case, Grace's health took another turn. In March 2024, she developed complications related to her weakened immune system, experiencing severe infections that required hospitalization. Her doctors warned her family that her condition had become critical, that despite their best efforts, her body was failing. Grace knew she was running out of time, and it was during this period, as her body weakened and her future shortened, that Grace made a decision that would ultimately seal Michael's fate. She decided to confront him one final time, not in person, but through a method that would preserve her words beyond her death. On the evening of May 15, 2024, Grace called Michael, asking him to come to the house. She told him they needed to talk, that there were things she wanted to say before she couldn't anymore. Michael agreed, arriving at the Maple Ridge house shortly after 9:12 p.m. What happened during the hours that followed would become the subject of intense scrutiny, forensic analysis, and ultimately a murder trial that captured national attention. But before we examine that final confrontation, we must first understand what investigators discovered when they began pulling apart the carefully constructed life Michael Porter had built, because beneath the surface of the reliable contractor and devoted husband lay secrets far darker than anyone had imagined. The investigation into Grace Porter's death began not with suspicion of foul play, but with routine procedure. When someone dies at home under medical care, particularly someone with a documented terminal illness, the death is typically treated as expected. But certain details from the night of May 15th triggered protocols that required deeper examination. First responder Sarah Chen, the paramedic who'd arrived within minutes of Michael's 911 call, filed a formal incident report noting inconsistencies at the scene. The overturned wheelchair, positioned several feet from Grace's body, showed no clear path of how Grace might have fallen. The oxygen mask, which Grace reportedly required continuously, had been torn from her face with enough force to leave marks on her skin. And Michael's demeanor, unnervingly calm for someone who just found their spouse unresponsive, raised immediate red flags. Chen's report reached Detective Sarah Mitchell's desk on the morning of May 16th, less than 12 hours after Grace's death. Mitchell, who'd been working with Grace on the preliminary HIV transmission case, recognized the name immediately. She requested a full autopsy, asking the medical examiner to look beyond the obvious cause of death and examine Grace's body for any signs of trauma or intervention. Dr. Patricia Moreno, the county medical examiner, conducted the autopsy on May 17th. Her findings, detailed in a 43-page report, revealed evidence that contradicted Michael's account of a simple fall. Grace's body showed bruising consistent with being restrained, specifically around her wrists and upper arms, suggesting someone had held her down. Her neck showed petechial hemorrhaging, small burst blood vessels often associated with asphyxiation or strangulation, though not definitive proof of either. Most critically, Grace's oxygen levels at the time of death indicated acute respiratory failure that likely occurred rapidly, not gradually, as one would expect from someone with chronic respiratory issues, simply experiencing a medical episode. Dr. Moreno's conclusion, while careful not to declare the manner of death definitively, stated that Grace's death was consistent with someone being physically restrained and denied access to oxygen. The report noted that while Grace's underlying medical conditions contributed to her death, there was evidence suggesting external intervention accelerated the process. Based on this autopsy report, Detective Mitchell escalated the investigation, reclassifying Grace's death from natural causes to suspicious circumstances. On May 20th, a search warrant was executed at the Porter residence on Maple Ridge Drive. A forensic team spent 9 hours documenting the scene, collecting evidence, and reconstructing what might have happened during those final hours. What they discovered in Grace's office would crack the case wide open. Among Grace's belongings, investigators found a smartphone hidden inside a locked drawer, separate from the phone Grace normally used. This second device, which Michael apparently didn't know existed, contained a trove of evidence Grace had carefully compiled over the past 2 years. There were voice recordings of conversations with Michael where he admitted knowing his HIV status before infecting her. There were screenshots of text messages between Michael and Robert Hale discussing their affair, some dating back to 2016. There were medical records documenting Grace's diagnosis, treatment, and deterioration. And most significantly, there was a voice message, time-stamped at 10:47 p.m. on May 15, 2024, approximately 1 hour before Michael's 911 call. In that recording, which would later be played in court and excerpted by media outlets worldwide, Grace's voice, weak but unmistakably clear, delivered a message that would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. The voicemail, lasting 2 minutes and 34 seconds, was addressed to Grace's mother, Margaret Williams. Grace had called her mother's phone knowing she wouldn't answer at that hour, deliberately leaving a message rather than engaging in real-time conversation. Her voice, struggling for breath between sentences, painted a picture of what was unfolding in the house at that very moment. "Mom," Grace began, "if you're hearing this, something's happened. Michael is here, and he's angry. I told him I'm pressing charges, that I spoke to the police, that everyone will know what he did. He's not taking it well." Her breathing, labored and shallow, filled the pauses between words. "I need you to know that I love you, that I tried to be strong, that I did everything right. If I don't make it, if something happens tonight, make sure they know the truth. Michael gave me HIV. He knew he was positive for 4 years and never told me. He infected me. He watched me die slowly. And tonight, when I told him I was going to make sure he paid for it, he said he couldn't let that happen." There was a pause in the recording, filled with the sound of footsteps in the background growing closer. Grace's next words came quickly, urgently. "He's coming back. Mom, I love you. Make sure they know. Tell Emily I'm sorry I won't be at her wedding. Tell my students to keep fighting." The recording ended abruptly, cut off mid-breath as though Grace had been interrupted. That message, discovered by investigators on May 20th and immediately recognized as potential evidence of premeditated murder, transformed the investigation from suspicious death to active homicide. Detective Mitchell assembled a task force, pulling in resources from the Franklin County Sheriff's Office and consulting with the Ohio Attorney General's Office on prosecution strategy. While the voicemail provided powerful evidence of Michael's state of mind and Grace's fear, investigators needed more to build an airtight case. They needed to prove not just that Michael had been present when Grace died, which he'd never denied, but that he'd actively caused her death, intentionally depriving her of oxygen until her compromised respiratory system could no longer sustain life. The forensic team returned to the Porter residence on May 22nd, conducting a more detailed search focused specifically on Michael's activities in the days and weeks leading up to Grace's death. In the garage, they found Michael's laptop, improperly disposed of in a garbage bag, as though he'd intended to discard it but hadn't followed through. Digital forensics experts recovered the device and began analyzing its contents, a process that would take weeks, but ultimately reveal a pattern of behavior suggesting premeditation. Michael's search history, reconstructed from partially deleted browser data, showed a disturbing progression. In early May 2024, he'd searched terms including, "Can someone with respiratory issues survive without oxygen?" "How long until oxygen deprivation causes death?" and "accidental death versus murder charges." On May 10th, just 5 days before Grace's death, Michael searched felony HIV transmission Ohio sentence and prison time for infecting spouse. On May 14th, the day before Grace died, he searched life insurance payout if spouse dies from illness and can police access deleted text messages. Each search, viewed individually, might be explained away. Collectively, they painted a picture of a man researching how to kill his wife and avoid detection. But perhaps most damning was a series of deleted text messages between Michael and Robert Hale, partially recovered through data extraction software. In these messages, exchanged in the days leading up to Grace's death, Michael expressed panic about the criminal investigation Grace had initiated. He wrote to Robert on May 12th, "She's going to destroy everything. Everyone will know. I can't let that happen." Robert responded, "You need to think clearly. Don't do anything stupid." Michael's reply, sent hours later, read simply, "I'm out of options." These messages, combined with the search history, the voicemail, and the autopsy findings, gave investigators the framework for a murder prosecution. But they needed one more piece. They needed to understand exactly how Grace died, the physical mechanism by which Michael had ended her life. Dr. Moreno, working with forensic pathologists from the state laboratory, conducted additional analysis on tissue samples collected during the autopsy. Their findings, released in early June 2024, provided the missing link. Grace had died from acute hypoxia, oxygen starvation to the brain and vital organs. The bruising on her wrists and arms indicated she'd been physically restrained, likely held down by someone stronger than her weakened body could resist. The petechial hemorrhaging in her eyes and neck suggested her oxygen supply had been cut off, not through strangulation, which would have left more pronounced marks, but through removal of her oxygen mask, combined with physical positioning that restricted her already compromised breathing. In essence, investigators believed Michael had held Grace down, removed her oxygen mask, and waited for her respiratory system to fail. Given Grace's medical condition, this process would have taken only minutes, perhaps less. The overturned wheelchair, they theorized, was staged after death to create the appearance of an accidental fall. Michael's 911 call, placed nearly an hour after Grace's voicemail to her mother, gave him time to clean up evidence, position the scene, and compose himself before summoning help. On June 3, 2024, 18 days after Grace's death, Michael Porter was arrested at his brother's apartment in Columbus, where he'd been staying since the initial investigation began. Detective Mitchell, accompanied by 4 officers, executed the arrest warrant at 6 a.m. Michael, according to the arrest report, showed no resistance and minimal emotion, asking only if he could call his attorney before being transported. He was charged with first-degree murder, felony transmission of HIV, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. His bail was set at $2 million, which he could not post, and he was remanded to Franklin County Jail to await trial. The arrest made headlines across Ohio and quickly gained national attention. News outlets focused on the voicemail, Grace's final message to her mother that had become the smoking gun in a case that combined medical betrayal with calculated murder. Legal analysts debated whether the prosecution could prove premeditation or whether Michael's defense team would argue a crime of passion, a moment of panic rather than planned execution. Victim advocacy groups seized on the case as an example of intimate partner violence and the deadly consequences of HIV disclosure laws not being strictly enforced. In the weeks following Michael's arrest, additional details emerged that deepened public outrage. Robert Hale, subpoenaed to testify before the grand jury, initially attempted to invoke spousal privilege, a legal protection that didn't apply since he wasn't married to Michael. Facing potential charges as an accessory if he continued to obstruct, Hale's attorney negotiated immunity in exchange for testimony. What Hale revealed in his sworn deposition, later leaked to the press, shocked even seasoned investigators. Hale confirmed that he and Michael had been involved in an intimate relationship since 2016, meeting at hotels and job sites when their schedules aligned. He admitted that Michael had never disclosed his HIV status, meaning Michael had potentially exposed Hale to the virus, just as he'd exposed Grace. Hale tested negative, likely due to Michael's medication keeping his viral load low, but the betrayal extended beyond Grace to every person Michael had intimate contact with. Hale also confirmed that Michael had expressed fear about Grace's criminal complaint multiple times in their final communications. According to Hale's testimony, Michael had said in early May 2024, "If she goes through with this, my life is over. I'll lose everything. I can't let that happen." Hale claimed he'd interpreted this as emotional venting, not a literal threat, but acknowledged in hindsight that Michael had been telegraphing his intentions. He stated that he'd ended the relationship with Michael in mid-May, telling him he couldn't be involved in whatever Michael was planning. That decision, Hale later said, probably saved his own life or freedom, as distancing himself from Michael before Grace's death meant he couldn't be charged as a co-conspirator. As the prosecution built its case throughout summer 2024, the defense team, led by veteran criminal attorney Marcus Brennan, began constructing a counter-narrative. Brennan's strategy, outlined in pre-trial motions, centered on several key arguments. First, he claimed Grace's death resulted from her medical condition, not from Michael's actions. He argued that Grace's respiratory system was so compromised that any stress, including an emotional confrontation, could have triggered fatal collapse. Second, Brennan challenged the admissibility of the voicemail, arguing it constituted hearsay since Grace wasn't available to testify and Michael couldn't cross-examine her claims. Third, he suggested the prosecution was conflating 2 separate issues: Michael's unethical behavior in transmitting HIV and Grace's death, when only the latter was relevant to the murder charge. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Dana Wilkins, countered each argument methodically. They brought in medical experts who testified that while Grace's condition was serious, she'd been medically stable for months prior to her death and showed no signs of imminent natural decline. They argued the voicemail fell under the dying declaration exception to hearsay rules, a legal principle allowing statements made by victims who believe they're about to die to be admitted as evidence. And they maintained that Michael's motive for murder, avoiding criminal prosecution for HIV transmission, was inseparable from understanding why Grace died when she did. The legal maneuvering continued through summer and into fall, with both sides filing dozens of motions, deposing witnesses and preparing for what promised to be one of Ohio's most closely watched trials in years. In the background, Grace's family, particularly her mother Margaret, became the public face of the case, giving carefully worded interviews about Grace's life, her strength, and her determination to see justice done, even as her own life slipped away. Margaret established a foundation in Grace's name, focused on HIV awareness and supporting survivors of intimate partner deception. She spoke at vigils, met with lawmakers about strengthening HIV disclosure laws, and carried her daughter's photograph to every court appearance, ensuring Grace's presence remained felt throughout the proceedings. The question everyone asked as the trial date approached was whether the evidence, circumstantial but compelling, would be enough to convince 12 jurors beyond reasonable doubt that Michael Porter had murdered his wife. The voicemail provided motive and state of mind. The autopsy provided cause of death. The digital evidence provided premeditation. But could the prosecution connect all these pieces into a narrative strong enough to overcome the defense's alternative explanations? The answer would come when the trial opened in November 2024, 6 months after Grace Porter's death, and 10 years almost to the day since she'd married the man accused of killing her. The trial of Michael Porter began on November 12, 2024, at the Franklin County Courthouse in Columbus, a grand building whose classical columns and marble interior had witnessed countless dramas but few as emotionally charged as this one. Media trucks lined the streets outside, reporters from major networks having descended on Ohio to cover a case that touched on issues resonating across the country: HIV criminalization, intimate partner violence, digital evidence in modern prosecutions, and the question of whether someone could literally get away with murder if they waited long enough for their victim to die naturally. The courtroom itself, presided over by Judge Elizabeth Hartman, a 20-year veteran of the bench, known for her strict adherence to procedure and low tolerance for theatrics, filled to capacity each day. Seats were claimed by journalists, legal observers, Grace's family and friends, and members of the public who'd followed the case and felt compelled to witness justice, or its absence, firsthand. Michael Porter, dressed in a charcoal suit that his attorney had carefully selected to project remorse without appearing calculated, sat at the defense table, flanked by his legal team. His expression throughout the proceedings remained largely neutral, occasionally showing flickers of emotion, but mostly maintaining the same detachment that had characterized his behavior since Grace's death. To observers, this lack of visible distress worked against him, reinforcing the prosecution's portrait of a man capable of cold calculation. The prosecution's opening statement, delivered by Dana Wilkins, lasted 43 minutes and methodically laid out the case the state intended to prove. She began not with the night of May 15th, but with the wedding day in June 2014, reminding jurors of the vows Michael had spoken, the promises he'd made before God and community. She traced the timeline of betrayal, Michael's secret affair beginning in 2016, his HIV diagnosis in 2018, his continued intimacy with Grace without disclosure, and Grace's infection sometime between 2018 and her diagnosis in 2022. Wilkins described Grace's slow deterioration, her growing suspicion, her confrontation with Michael, and her determination to hold him accountable through the legal system. Then Wilkins pivoted to the night of Grace's death, describing the voicemail, the search history, the text messages to Robert Hale. She told jurors this case is about a man who infected his wife with a deadly virus, watched her decline for years, and when she finally threatened to expose him when she chose justice over silence, he chose murder over consequence. Wilkins ended by promising that the evidence would show beyond any doubt that Michael Porter killed Grace Porter to silence her, to preserve his freedom, and to avoid accountability for the years of lies that had already destroyed her life. The defense's opening, delivered by Marcus Brennan, took a different approach. Brennan didn't deny Michael's affair, didn't deny the HIV transmission, didn't deny the moral failure these actions represented. Instead, he asked jurors to separate their emotional response to Michael's behavior from the legal question of whether he'd committed murder. He argued that Grace died because her body, ravaged by HIV and its complications, finally gave out during a stressful confrontation. He suggested the voicemail, while heartbreaking, represented Grace's fear and anger rather than an accurate prediction of what would happen. He pointed out that no witnesses saw Michael physically assault Grace, that the medical evidence was consistent with respiratory failure from natural causes, and that the prosecution's theory required jurors to believe Michael was both calculating enough to research murder techniques, but careless enough to leave a trail of digital evidence. Brennan concluded by acknowledging Michael's failures as a husband, while urging jurors not to convict him of murder, simply because they found his prior conduct reprehensible. "The law requires proof beyond reasonable doubt," he said, "not proof beyond emotional reaction." Over the following 2 weeks, the prosecution called 37 witnesses, each adding pieces to the puzzle they were constructing. Dr. Patricia Moreno testified about the autopsy findings, explaining the bruising, the petechial hemorrhaging, and the manner of death in language accessible to jurors without medical training. She acknowledged under cross-examination that Grace's underlying condition made her vulnerable to respiratory failure, but maintained that the physical evidence suggested external intervention. Digital forensics expert Thomas Reynolds walked jurors through Michael's search history, explaining how deleted data could be recovered and demonstrating that the searches occurred in a logical sequence, suggesting planning rather than random curiosity. Detective Sarah Mitchell testified about the investigation, the discovery of Grace's hidden phone, and the moment she first heard the voicemail that would become central to the case. But the most emotionally powerful testimony came from Grace's mother, Margaret Williams, who took the stand on the 7th day of trial. Margaret, dressed in black and clutching a photo of Grace, spoke in a steady voice about her daughter's character, her dedication to helping others, and her courage in confronting the truth, even when it cost her everything. When the prosecution asked Margaret about the voicemail, about listening to her daughter's final message, Margaret's composure cracked. She described receiving the message the morning after Grace's death, initially thinking it was just another check-in call, then hearing Grace's labored breathing and desperate words. "I knew immediately," Margaret testified, "that Michael had killed her, that my daughter had called me in her final moments to make sure the truth came out, to make sure he couldn't lie his way out of what he'd done." The courtroom fell silent as prosecutors played the voicemail for jurors, Grace's voice filling the chamber, weak but clear, delivering her final testimony from beyond the grave. Several jurors visibly struggled to maintain composure, one wiping tears, another looking away. Michael Porter, seated at the defense table, showed no visible reaction, a detail multiple news outlets would emphasize in their coverage. The defense's cross-examination of Margaret Williams was brief and cautious, Brennan understanding that attacking a grieving mother would alienate the jury. He focused instead on establishing that Margaret hadn't been present the night of Grace's death, hadn't witnessed the confrontation, and couldn't testify to what actually happened beyond what the voicemail suggested. Margaret conceded these points but added, unprompted, that she didn't need to be there to know what happened. "Grace told me exactly what would happen, and she was right." The defense called its own witnesses, including medical experts, who testified that Grace's death could have been caused by stress-induced respiratory failure without physical intervention. They presented character witnesses who described Michael as non-violent and incapable of murder. But the most critical defense witness was Michael himself, who took the stand on the 15th day of trial against his attorney's recommendation. Michael's testimony lasted nearly 6 hours, spanning 2 days. He admitted the affair with Robert Hale, admitted knowing he was HIV positive since 2018, admitted failing to disclose his status to Grace. When asked why he continued intimate relations with Grace after his diagnosis, Michael claimed he believed his medication made transmission impossible, that his doctors had told him his viral load was undetectable, and that he'd convinced himself the risk was negligible. Under direct examination, Michael described the night of May 15th from his perspective. He claimed Grace had called him to the house to discuss their situation, that she'd been emotional and accusatory, that the conversation had escalated. He admitted she'd threatened to press charges to make sure everyone knew what he'd done. But he insisted he'd never touched her, never restrained her, never removed her oxygen mask. He claimed Grace had become agitated during their argument, that her breathing had grown labored, that he'd urged her to calm down and use her oxygen. He said she'd refused, continuing to yell at him, and then suddenly she'd collapsed. He said he'd panicked, checking her pulse, trying to revive her, and when he couldn't, he'd called 911. He acknowledged the hour-long gap between Grace's voicemail and his 911 call, claiming he'd spent that time trying to help Grace and hadn't known she'd called her mother. His explanation for the search history was that he'd been trying to understand the legal consequences he faced, not planning a murder. His deleted text messages to Robert Hale, he claimed, reflected fear and anxiety, not intent to harm. The cross-examination of Michael Porter by Diana Wilkins became the trial's pivotal moment. Wilkins spent 4 hours systematically dismantling Michael's testimony, highlighting contradictions and implausibilities. She asked why, if Grace had collapsed naturally, there were bruises consistent with restraint on her wrists and arms. Michael claimed he might have grabbed her, trying to keep her from falling. Wilkins asked why Grace's oxygen mask had been found several feet from her body, with enough damage to suggest it had been torn away. Michael said it might have come off when she fell. Wilkins asked why he'd waited nearly an hour to call for help if Grace had collapsed suddenly. Michael said he'd lost track of time while trying to revive her. Then Wilkins played the voicemail again, asking Michael to explain how Grace had predicted, with such specificity, that something would happen to her that night if he'd had no intention of harming her. Michael responded that Grace had been paranoid, her judgment clouded by illness and anger. Wilkins pressed, "So your dying wife recorded a message predicting you would kill her, and then she coincidentally died during your argument, and you expect this jury to believe that's just tragic timing?" Michael's response, delivered quietly, would be quoted in countless media reports. "I didn't plan to hurt her," he said, "but yes, I understand how it looks." Wilkins ended her cross-examination with a final question. "Mr. Porter, do you expect anyone in this courtroom to believe that Grace Porter, a woman who dedicated her life to helping others, who confronted the truth even when it destroyed her, died by accident on the same night she told her mother, you'd said you couldn't let her press charges?" Michael's answer, after a long pause, was simply, "I'm telling you what happened." The prosecution rested its case on November 29th, 2 weeks and 3 days after the trial began. Closing arguments were scheduled for December 2nd, giving both sides a brief weekend to prepare their final appeals to the jury. In the days between, legal analysts debated whether the prosecution had proven its case beyond reasonable doubt, or whether the defense had successfully created enough alternative explanations to generate uncertainty. The circumstantial nature of the evidence, they noted, made the case challenging. No witnesses saw Michael kill Grace. No weapon was involved. The prosecution's theory relied on jurors believing that a compilation of searches, messages, autopsy findings, and a voicemail added up to murder when viewed together. But circumstantial evidence, as prosecutors noted, often proved more reliable than eyewitness testimony, and the pattern here was undeniable. On December 2nd, both sides delivered their closing arguments. Wilkins spoke for 90 minutes, walking jurors through each piece of evidence again, connecting them into a coherent narrative. She reminded jurors of Michael's motive, avoiding prosecution for HIV transmission, his opportunity, alone with Grace in their home, and his means, physically overpowering a weakened woman and depriving her of oxygen. She addressed the defense's alternative explanations, noting how many coincidences the jury would have to accept for Michael's version to be true. Grace just happens to call her mother, predicting Michael will harm her, then just happens to die during their argument, after Michael just happens to have researched accidental deaths and prison sentences, while just happening to have the physical evidence of restraint on her body. Wilkins ended by invoking Grace's voice, reminding jurors that Grace had given them the truth directly, bypassing any need for inference or deduction. "She told you what happened," Wilkins said. "The only question is whether you believe her." Brennan's closing argument, lasting 70 minutes, urged jurors to resist emotional decision-making and focus on reasonable doubt. He acknowledged Michael's moral failures, but argued that bad husband didn't equal murderer. He pointed out gaps in the prosecution's evidence, the lack of witnesses, the absence of a definitive cause of death beyond respiratory failure that could be explained naturally, and the ambiguity in the digital evidence. He suggested the prosecution had built a compelling story, but not an airtight case, and that reasonable doubt existed in the spaces between circumstantial pieces. He ended by reminding jurors of their oath to convict only if proof beyond reasonable doubt existed, not merely proof that seemed likely or probable. Judge Hartman instructed the jury on the applicable law, including definitions of first-degree murder, premeditation, and reasonable doubt. She sent them to deliberate at 2:30 p.m. on December 2nd, a Monday afternoon when rain fell steadily outside the courthouse windows. Deliberation took less than 2 hours. At 4:15 p.m., the jury foreperson sent a note to Judge Hartman indicating they'd reached a verdict. The speed of the decision surprised legal observers, some of whom had expected days of deliberation, given the complexity of the evidence. Court staff contacted both legal teams, and at 5 p.m. the courtroom reconvened, packed with spectators who'd waited all day for this moment. Michael Porter stood as the jury filed back into the courtroom, his expression blank. Grace's family, seated in the front row, held hands. Margaret Williams clutching her daughter's photo, as she'd done throughout the trial. Judge Hartman asked the foreperson, a middle-aged man identified later as a retired teacher, if the jury had reached a verdict. He confirmed they had. The clerk read the verdict sheet aloud. On the count of first-degree murder, we the jury find the defendant, Michael Porter, guilty. The courtroom erupted in gasps and muted reactions. Margaret Williams closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face, whispering, "Thank you, God," repeatedly. Michael Porter's expression didn't change, though his attorney placed a hand on his shoulder. The clerk continued reading verdicts on the remaining charges: guilty of felony transmission of HIV, guilty of tampering with evidence, guilty of obstruction of justice. Judge Hartman thanked the jury and dismissed them, scheduling sentencing for December 16th. As Michael was escorted from the courtroom in handcuffs, he turned briefly toward Grace's family, his face finally showing something resembling emotion. Whether remorse or resignation was impossible to say. Outside the courthouse, Dana Wilkins addressed a crowd of reporters, stating that justice had been served for Grace Porter, a woman who'd found the courage to speak truth even in her final moments. She credited Grace's foresight in recording her evidence, noting that without the voicemail and the hidden phone, the case would have been nearly impossible to prove. Wilkins added that this verdict sent a message that intimate partner deception, particularly involving transmission of serious diseases, carried severe consequences, and that victims who fought back deserved justice. Margaret Williams, speaking briefly to the press, said simply, "My daughter's voice was heard, that's all I wanted. For Grace to be heard and believed." The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later was brief. Judge Hartman, citing the premeditated nature of the crime, the breach of trust inherent in spousal murder, and the aggravating factor of Michael's underlying HIV transmission, sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ohio law allowed for such a sentence in first-degree murder cases, and Judge Hartman saw no reason to show leniency. Before being formally remanded, Michael was given an opportunity to make a statement. He stood, addressed the court, and spoke for less than a minute. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "I never wanted Grace to die, I just wanted to protect myself." That admission, though framed as an expression of regret, effectively confirmed everything the prosecution had argued, that Michael's actions had been driven by self-preservation, that Grace's life had been worth less to him than avoiding consequence. Dana Wilkins, responding after the sentencing, told reporters he didn't mean for it to go that far, but it went exactly as far as he let it. He made choices every step of the way, choosing deception over honesty, choosing silence over disclosure, and finally choosing murder over accountability. Michael Porter entered the state penitentiary weeks later, stripped of the image he'd cultivated for decades, the reliable contractor, the devoted husband, the man you could trust with your house keys. What remained was a life sentence, the slow passage of years in a 6x8 cell, and the knowledge that Grace Porter's voice, recorded in a moment of fear and courage, had accomplished what she'd set out to do. It had told the truth, and ensured that truth mattered more than lies. The aftermath of the Porter case extended far beyond the courtroom, rippling through Brookdale, across Ohio, and into national conversations about HIV criminalization, intimate partner violence, and the role of technology in modern justice. Grace's story became a rallying point for advocacy groups working on multiple fronts, from strengthening disclosure laws to supporting survivors of deception and abuse. Margaret Williams, Grace's mother, emerged as a powerful voice for change, channeling her grief into action in ways Grace would have recognized and admired. Within months of the trial's conclusion, Margaret established the Grace Porter Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to HIV awareness, legal advocacy for survivors of partner-transmitted diseases, and support services for individuals navigating the intersection of intimate betrayal and serious illness. The foundation partnered with medical institutions, legal aid organizations, and domestic violence prevention groups to create comprehensive resources addressing the complex challenges victims faced. Margaret spoke at conferences, met with state legislators, and worked with attorneys to draft model legislation strengthening penalties for knowingly transmitting infectious diseases and expanding legal protections for victims. Her advocacy helped pass the Grace Porter Act in Ohio in 2026, legislation that enhanced criminal penalties for HIV transmission, required mandatory testing and disclosure in certain circumstances, and created civil remedies allowing victims to sue for damages even when criminal prosecution didn't proceed. The law also addressed digital evidence preservation, recognizing that in an era when much of our lives existed in electronic form, protecting that evidence was crucial for justice. Robert Hale, the man at the center of the secret affair that had triggered the entire tragedy, faced his own reckoning. News of his involvement spread quickly once trial testimony revealed the nature of his relationship with Michael. His wife, Linda Hale, filed for divorce within a month, ending a 23-year marriage that had produced 2 children, and built a life neither had suspected was built on lies. The divorce proceedings were contentious, with Linda seeking and ultimately receiving substantial financial settlements and full custody of their minor children. Court documents described Robert's conduct as a pattern of deception that had destroyed the family's foundation of trust. Hale Construction, once a thriving business with multi-million-dollar contracts across Ohio, began losing clients steadily as news of Robert's involvement became public. Within 6 months of the trial's conclusion, the company had folded under combined financial pressure and reputational damage. Former employees described a rapid collapse, clients canceling contracts, banks calling loans, and suppliers demanding immediate payment. Robert, facing both financial ruin and social ostracism, reportedly sold his remaining assets and left Ohio entirely. Some reports claimed he moved to Arizona, seeking anonymity in a place where his name carried no recognition. Others suggested he'd sought treatment for addiction issues that had emerged during the stress of the investigation and trial. What was certain was that Robert Hale had vanished from Brookdale, his former prominence replaced by whispered speculation and cautionary warnings about the cost of deception. Grace's colleagues at Brookdale Elementary created a scholarship in her name, awarded annually to a student pursuing counseling or social work, fields where Grace had made such an impact. The school also dedicated its counseling center in Grace's honor, placing a plaque with her photograph and a quote from one of her journal entries that had been read during the trial. "The greatest gift we can give someone is to see them fully and love them anyway." Students who'd never met Grace learned her story, understanding that the room where they received support and guidance carried the name of someone who'd believed deeply in the power of listening and the importance of truth. Brookdale itself struggled to process what had happened within its quiet streets. The town, small enough that most residents knew the Porters at least by reputation, found itself confronting uncomfortable questions about how well we really know our neighbors, about what happens behind closed doors, and about whether the image people project bears any relationship to the reality they live. Churches held community gatherings focused on healing and prevention. Mental health professionals offered free counseling sessions for those affected by the case. Local organizations hosted discussions about recognizing signs of domestic deception and understanding the legal and medical implications of diseases like HIV. The case also reignited national debates about HIV criminalization laws, with advocates on multiple sides weighing in. Some argued that laws criminalizing HIV transmission were necessary to protect public health and hold individuals accountable for knowingly exposing others. They pointed to Grace's case as evidence that without serious legal consequences, people like Michael Porter could act with impunity, destroying lives without fear of justice. Others contended that criminalization laws were often applied unfairly, disproportionately affecting marginalized communities and people of color, and that they stigmatized HIV status rather than encouraging testing and treatment. They argued that Michael Porter should have been prosecuted for murder based on his actions the night Grace died, not for HIV transmission, and that conflating the two created dangerous precedents. These debates played out in academic journals, at public health conferences, and in legislative hearings across multiple states. Grace's story was invoked by both sides, used to illustrate both the need for and the dangers of criminalization, depending on the speaker's perspective. What was undeniable, regardless of one's position on the broader legal questions, was that Grace Porter's case had forced a national conversation that many had been avoiding about consent, about trust, about the obligations partners owe each other, and about how society should respond when those obligations are violated in ways that cause permanent harm. In the years following the trial, several documentaries and investigative journalism pieces explored the Porter case in depth, interviewing people who'd known Grace and Michael, examining the investigation and trial, and analyzing the broader implications. One Netflix documentary, released in 2027, featured extensive interviews with Margaret Williams, Detective Sarah Mitchell, and several jurors who agreed to discuss their deliberation process. The jurors revealed that Grace's voicemail had been the decisive piece of evidence for them, that hearing her voice, knowing she'd recorded it, believing she might die that night, had eliminated any reasonable doubt about Michael's intent. One juror, the retired teacher who'd served as foreperson, stated, "When you hear someone predict their own murder, and then they die exactly as predicted, you don't need a PhD to understand what happened." The documentary also explored the digital evidence, showing how investigators had reconstructed Michael's activities and mindset from fragments of data he'd thought were erased. Forensic experts explained that in the modern age, digital footprints were nearly impossible to fully erase, that everything we searched, every message we sent, every website we visited left traces that skilled investigators could recover and interpret. This aspect of the case resonated particularly with younger viewers, many of whom had grown up in the digital era, but hadn't fully considered how their online activities could be used in legal proceedings. Michael Porter, serving his life sentence at a maximum security facility in southern Ohio, gave one interview to a journalist in 2028, 4 years after Grace's death. In that interview, conducted through glass via telephone and later published in a major magazine, Michael offered what some interpreted as an admission and others saw as continued deflection. He acknowledged that he'd made terrible choices, that he'd hurt Grace in ways he couldn't undo, and that he accepted responsibility for her death. But he also maintained that he'd never intended to kill her, that the confrontation had spiraled beyond his control, and that he'd acted out of panic rather than calculation. When asked about the voicemail, about Grace's prediction that he would harm her, Michael claimed she'd been right to be afraid, but wrong about his intentions, that he'd wanted to scare her into silence, not to actually hurt her. Critics noted that this explanation contradicted the physical evidence of restraint and oxygen deprivation, suggesting Michael was still trying to control the narrative even from prison. Supporters of Grace, including her family and advocacy groups, largely ignored the interview, viewing it as an attempt to rehabilitate Michael's image without providing genuine insight or remorse. Margaret Williams, when asked by reporters about Michael's statements, responded simply, "My daughter told the truth. Everything that came after just confirms she was right." The Porter case also had lasting impacts on medical and legal communities. Medical schools began including more robust training on patient confidentiality, partner notification protocols, and the ethical obligations healthcare providers face when patients test positive for infectious diseases. Legal professionals studied the case as an example of how circumstantial evidence, when properly compiled and presented, could overcome the absence of direct eyewitness testimony. The voicemail in particular became a subject of legal scholarship, with dozens of law review articles analyzing its admissibility under dying declaration exceptions to hearsay rules and discussing how courts should handle evidence recorded on personal devices that might not have been intended for legal proceedings, but become crucial after death. For Brookdale's residents, the Porter case became a marker, a before and after moment that changed how the community understood itself. The town that had prided itself on being the kind of place where neighbors looked out for each other, where marriages lasted, and people kept their promises, had to confront the reality that darkness could exist anywhere, that evil didn't always announce itself with obvious signs, and that the most dangerous people were often those who appeared most trustworthy. But the case also reinforced something Grace had believed deeply, that truth mattered, that speaking up even when it cost everything could make a difference, and that courage in the face of betrayal could inspire others long after the person who showed that courage was gone. In the quiet aftermath of everything, as years passed and the intensity of public attention faded, one truth remained undeniable. Grace Porter had been betrayed by the man she'd trusted most, infected with a disease that would slowly destroy her body and ultimately murdered to silence her efforts at justice. But Grace had fought back using the tools available to her: documentation, voice recordings, and an unshakable commitment to truth. She'd known she was dying, known Michael posed a threat, and known that her only chance at justice was ensuring her voice survived beyond her death. And it had. Her final words, recorded in a moment of fear and strength, had accomplished what Grace couldn't accomplish while living. They'd exposed Michael Porter, completely stripped away every lie, and ensured that the truth she'd fought so hard to reveal couldn't be buried with her. To everyone watching, to anyone who has followed this story from that May night in 2024 through the trial and into the years that followed, let Grace Porter's life serve as a reminder of several crucial truths. Love without honesty is not love at all. It's control wrapped in comfort, obligation disguised as commitment. Awareness saves lives. Understanding the importance of disclosure, consent, and transparency in intimate relationships can prevent tragedies like Grace's from repeating. Justice demands courage, not just from victims who must find the strength to speak up, but from communities that must believe them, from investigators who must pursue truth regardless of how complicated the case becomes, and from jurors who must weigh evidence fairly, even when emotion threatens to cloud judgment. Empathy begins with truth. We cannot help or heal what we refuse to acknowledge, and the first step toward preventing intimate partner violence and deception is admitting it happens even in places like Brookdale, even to people like Grace, even in marriages that looked perfect from the outside. Because in the end, no matter how long deceit hides, no matter how carefully lies are constructed, truth has a way of emerging. Sometimes it speaks through evidence, through digital footprints and forensic analysis. Sometimes it speaks through the testimony of those who witnessed the aftermath. And sometimes, as in Grace Porter's case, it speaks directly, preserved in a voice recording that outlasted the person who made it, carrying her words forward through time until justice finally listened. Grace believed in the power of being heard, of listening to others and ensuring they felt seen and understood. In her final act, she ensured she would be heard too, that her truth would survive, that Michael Porter's lies would crumble under the weight of evidence she'd carefully compiled. She couldn't save herself. Her body had been too damaged, the betrayal too complete. But she could save the truth, and in doing so, she ensured that others might learn from her story, might recognize warning signs earlier, might find courage to speak up sooner, might demand the honesty and respect every person deserves in their most intimate relationships. Grace Porter's legacy isn't just about what happened to her, it's about what she refused to let happen after her death. She refused to let Michael Porter escape accountability. She refused to let silence protect the guilty. She refused to let her life end without meaning. And though she paid the ultimate price for Michael's deception, her voice, strong and clear and undeniable, became the instrument of his downfall. As we close this investigation into one of Ohio's most disturbing cases of intimate betrayal and murder, remember Grace not as a victim defined by how she died, but as a woman defined by how she lived and fought. Remember her students who felt seen because she truly listened. Remember her colleagues who learned from her dedication. Remember her mother, who transformed grief into advocacy. And remember the truth she recorded in her final hours. Truth that proved stronger than lies, more enduring than deception, and ultimately more powerful than the man who tried to silence it forever.